everybody. Welcome. I know you probably don't need to hear me in the microphone, but it's good for the recording. So welcome. Thanks for being here. My name is Lily Fink Shapiro. I'm the program manager for a group on campus called the University of Michigan Sustainable Food Systems Initiative. And we are one of the 3 groups organizing this mini series. So along with our colleagues at LACSIS, the Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and as well as SEAS. So this is the second talk in this series, and just mark your calendar, same time, same place at 4 p.m. on March 31st is going to be the 3rd talk in this Brazil at a Crossroads series. So I'll say it again, March 31st at 4 p.m. we're going to have Susanna Hecht. Really quickly, the University of Michigan Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, we are a group of over 70 affiliated faculty and staff all across campus who research and teach about various aspects of food systems. We offer a lot of courses, both undergraduate and graduate level in food systems. We have a minor for undergraduates. We have a graduate certificate, and as well as interesting events like this throughout the year. We have the new TFS fellowship for underrepresented graduate students is going to launch this fall. We have the food literacy for all class on Tuesday evenings that's open to anyone around the world can join us. So hope to see you there. And with that, I'll pass it off to Yvette Perfecto to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Lily. Welcome, everybody. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Gustavo Oliveira. Gustavo was born and raised in Brazil. And then his family decided to immigrate. I just learned this morning, to immigrate to the United States. So he spent part of his life in Florida from high school on. He has a PhD in geography from the University of California, Berkeley. And his research basically is on the Chinese investment in Brazilian agribusiness and related infrastructure. That was his dissertation research. And for this, he conducted extensive ethnographic field studies in both Brazil and China. And he was also a visiting scholar at the Northwest Agriculture and Forestry University in China, and a visiting assistant professor later on at Peking University, a College of Urban and Environmental Sciences. Then from there on, he took a position as an assistant professor at UC Irvine, where he's still a professor there. And he's a member of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network's Science Panel of the Amazon, and also a member of the International Secretariat of the BRICS Initiative for Critical Agrarian Studies. With Susanna Hecht, who's our next speaker in a couple of weeks from now. With Susanna, he co-edited a book called Soy, Globalization and Environmental Politics in South America. I would say that he's probably one of the world's, if not the world's, expert on Brazil-China relations, what has to do with agribusiness, and in particular soybean plantations. And so with that, it's a pleasure to have you here. I've been reading your work for a long time, since you applied for the postdoctoral position here several years ago. And I'm fascinated by your research, and that's why I decided, that this would be a great opportunity to have you here and put us up to date to what's going on in Brazil and Brazil-China relationships, and especially under the Bolsonaro regime. So with that, I'll leave you with Gustavo Oliveira. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. It's truly an honor to be here and to have been invited by Yvette Perfecto and John Vandermeer. I've been reading your work longer than you're reading mine, for sure. And it is spectacular to have a chance to talk with you about some of my research. So I will be talking today about updating an article that I wrote. I began writing it in 2013 on the geopolitics of Brazilian soybeans. that was published in 2016 in a special issue of the Journal of Peasant Studies that I co-edited with Susanna Hecht, as Yvette mentioned. That's the book that's the collection that we then republished. Now, of course, that work came out before not only Bolsonaro came into power, but also before the US-China trade war. So this invitation for me was a really exciting opportunity to revisit some of this earlier work and try to consider how things have changed and what matters about that and what we can take from it. I'm going to today first cover some of that previous work, basically give you a crash course introduction to the geopolitics of Brazilian soy, covering most of the 20th century up until that moment. And then I'm going to talk about, where did Bolsonaro come from? How are we to understand his rise? And how are we to understand the dynamics of soybean agribusiness, not just in Brazil, but in this global context that's been particularly marked now by the US-China trade war. My argument is that what we see now in recent years is a reconfiguration of both class interests in the soybean agribusiness sector and also agro-environmental discourses, and that these are the key forces that are shaping this new geopolitics of Brazilian soy. So let's begin with some of this history. Soybeans were first brought to Brazil in the 1890s, 1893 to be particular, but just for agronomic experiments. They only began to be planted in a more sustained manner starting in 1908 when Japanese immigrants started to arrive in Brazil and brought Japanese seeds to farm for their own household consumption. This was not yet commercial soy production, but it really matters because this played already a very important geopolitical role. Most of these Japanese migrants were actually not Japanese, they were Okinawan, and they were being shipped off to Brazil in a moment of Japanese imperial expansion from the mainland or the main islands of Japan into Okinawa. And this had massive state support, both from the Japanese side and the Brazilian side. There was a conjoint interest in articulating a colonization process. And this really was extremely effective. Brazil now has over 1.5 million Japanese Brazilians. Nikkei is the largest Japanese diaspora anywhere in the world, unless you count Okinawa, not Japan, but still. And during this process, they did start to farm soy crops that did not previously exist or that were not established in Brazil. But soy was not yet the cash crop. It was not the commercial crop. It still continued to be very much the varieties of beans that were more selected for their nutritional aspects and more for kind of artisanal production than what came later on. But what then became quickly recognized is that the nodules in this leguminous plant were very useful to defray the loss of nutrients that was happening, especially with wheat and maize, corn plantation in southern Brazil. So soybeans started to be picked up by other migrants that were also being brought in a similar colonization process, especially migrants from Central Europe, such as these Japanese migrants there. To prove that they're German, here's pictures of them holding Brazilian flags, German flags, and Nazi flags at the same time. Now, the geopolitical piece of this story has less to do with Nazism and it has more to do with the dynamics of migration in general. Immigration, out-migration, can reduce political pressure in places of origin. So places where poor peasants might have become problematic forces demanding land redistribution, if they could be shipped off, then you could consolidate larger scale commercial agriculture in Okinawa or the kind of like scaling up of agricultural production that was taking place also in Europe. This outlet for this so-called excess population was integral to this process, both from Japan and from Europe. While in the recipient parts of this process, you have the integration of farmers that are more experienced with commercial agriculture that could then be instrumentalized to so-called integrate hinterlands, pacify the hinterlands from indigenous populations or less productive or less commercially oriented peasants. And especially in places like Brazil, this was also very much around the idea of settling border areas. And non-Brazilians, non-South Americans might forget that South America had terribly violent wars in the 19th century to determine what is the extent of the Brazilian empire, what are the extent of the other nations, and countries like Paraguay and Uruguay emerged directly out of these geopolitical confrontations. Now back to those nodules. This kind of immigrant seed then really took root through the process of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, I think, is very familiar to most folks, but is very much talked about a process focused on, say, Mexico and Philippines wheat. There's not too much attention of what that really looked like in Brazil, and I argue that soybeans were a central pillar of the Green Revolution in Brazil. And to understand this, you have to look at some of this geopolitics of soy at that moment of the origins of the Green Revolution. With World War II, you had two things going on. You had a process of both industrialization of livestock, more and more concentration of animal feed operations, the integration of vitamin additives that enabled year-round concentration of livestock that had never before been possible, and also restrictions on exports of soy meal from Manchuria, present-day northeastern China, which then put pressure on both the livestock and vegetable oil industries in the US. So just as the US was starting to really industrialize both the vegetable oil industry and the livestock, they then had this, war-based motivation to look for domestic sources, both for the vegetable oil industry and for the burgeoning livestock industry. That is what kind of made the Midwest here of the United States integrate soy and then transform it into what it has become today. And this happened then also in places that were very influenced by the US as part of that mid-20th century Cold War geopolitical scenario. Gradually, in places like Brazil, soy meal started to be shifted from just a mere byproduct from the vegetable oil industry to a strategic input for livestock industry. I should have made more explicit that when the migrants were farming soy at first, it was not for the beans, it was as green manure. They were farming it oftentimes on the winter season in order to basically just reduce erosion and try and replenish nitrogen, while the cash crops were wheat and maize. But gradually, the experience of farming soy then took on the possibility of crushing it, and the burgeoning vegetable oil industry in Brazil started to integrate soy as an input, and the soy meal came on later through especially University of Illinois trained agronomists and agro-industrialists who were, on the one hand, industrializing agribusiness in Brazil, and on the other hand, also literally tropicalizing gradually seeds. So while the first seeds were from Japan, they were large, nutritious, kind of made to be harvested by hand. By the 40s and 50s, we start to have US bred soy starting to be planted in southern Brazil. And this had a very clear geopolitical dimension as well. And this guy is particularly important in this story, General Golbery de Souto Silva. He was the leading geopolitics theoretician in Brazil. Played an important role in a lot of the political movements from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And by the 1960s, he was actually able to consolidate power effectively as the leader of the secret service in Brazil, the military dictatorship that I'll tell you a bit more about. But then afterwards, he also seamlessly moved into the board of a major transnational fertilizer company, running their business in Latin America. His argument is very much in line with what Raj Patel has argued in that great article, The Long Green Revolution, that the Green Revolution was in effect not just a technocratical modernization force, it was really a political process. It was a Green Revolution to avoid a Red Revolution. And in that Cold War context, Brazil was made to be the bulwark against communism in South America. So people like Couto Silva had an idea of unfolding Green Revolution reforms with these geopolitical purposes, linking internal stability, integrating empty spaces, increasing foreign exchange as a means to finance industrialization, and guaranteeing external security. Basically, using commercial agriculture as a political force to integrate the hinterlands and to not only have this military occupation of borderlands, literally, but also to generate the economic conditions that would stabilize peasant revolts and that could then finance industrialization. In effect, this is settler colonialism ongoing. In the 20th century in Brazil, this was called the March to the West. Any echoes with our history of the US are not coincidence. And of course, the longer history of settler colonialism and slavery is also quite familiar to, I imagine, most of us here, so I don't have to go too much in depth in this. These were not empty spaces. These were deeply, vibrantly populated, diversely populated places, even through the colonial period. And these people launched massive resistance to this process. The Green Revolution in Brazil, as everywhere else, was not uncontested. In fact, Brazil had a very powerful rural communist movement from the 30s to the 70s, mainly led by plantation workers in the sugarcane fields in the Northeast that were launching massive strikes. Places like the Cerrado in southern Brazil, a lot of those second, third, fourth generation small-scale farmers, colonizers that could no longer access land, were becoming landless, were actually starting to fight against land grabs or fight for more land. In some cases, even taken up arms, having armed uprisings. This bubbling up movement, this rural ferment pushing for agrarian reform, finally pushed the democratically elected and center-left government of João Goulart in 1964 to finally declare, okay, we're going to undertake agrarian reform. We're going to undertake land redistribution. 19 days later, the military stepped in. General Couto Silva, again, as part of that with the military coup. The military coup forced the president into exile. They arrested, tortured, murdered, and drove into exile effectively all the leaders of the peasant leagues, of the peasant movements, of the Communist Party, and of other civil society organizations that dared resist. This, of course, was not only a domestic Brazilian matter, this was done with the backing of the CIA and with a US Navy ship offshore loaded with guns and ammo and such. And by imposing this military dictatorship, not only was the process of agrarian reform in Brazil halted, but really the consolidation of Brazil as a bulwark against communism in South America. This became the Operation Condor, where similar dictatorships in Argentina, Chile, and other countries effectively united to maintain South America in the thick grip of the free world during the 20th century. And the consequence of this also was that, of course, agrarian reform, land redistribution did not take place. Instead, what unfolded is what we call the conservative modernization of the Brazilian countryside. In effect, this is the Green Revolution. These are the institutional mechanisms through which a highly modern agro-industrial production system was overlaid on colonial era patterns of land distribution and labor relations. So you have finance, state-owned banks coming in heavily, not just with credit for farmers to buy seeds and fertilizers, but also financing machinery, mechanization, and so forth and so on. You have research. You have the establishment of world-class research institutions focused especially on the Cerrado, which will be important, and on soy. And again, these people were being trained at the best land grant institutions here in the US and basically bringing into Brazil USDA regimes of truth. Extension also was an important part of this, as well as infrastructure construction. Infrastructure, I'm talking about not just roads and warehouses, but everything, including irrigation. And really, there was this entire set of government policies, of regional development programs that would take a particular region and say, we're going to make heavy state investments here in infrastructure and bring in all this capital and bring in the extension. And those who became not just demonstration centers, but really poles of development, as they spoke, from which commercial agriculture as that would then kind of expand throughout the rest of the region. This is what enabled Brazil and Argentina, which are really the main lines, what makes up this dark black line here. This is what enabled South America soy production to start to grow very strong since the 60s and the 70s. And then by the 2000s, surpass even North America, which is basically the US. If you look at exports, this is even clearer. While China, India still produce a fair amount of soy, they don't really export it. This is basically a game between US, Brazil, and to a lesser extent, Argentina and other players. As you can see here, how quickly Brazil basically gain half of the global market share of soy through this process. And all of this is basically going to East Asia. At first, this was mainly Japan, but then more recently, especially China. I'm not going to talk as much about Chinese investments in Brazil and in soy. That's for another talk, that's for another book, but I'll touch on it here and there. What I want to come back to is this geography and this geopolitics of it. Soy production in Brazil expanded from first the south, where you had that pattern of Japanese and Central European colonization, northwards towards the Cerrado, towards the Central Highlands. So nowadays, what you see is that the bulk of the soy expansion has taken place in this blue area here, which is the Cerrado ecosystem. And I'll talk about some of the dynamics in the neighboring countries as well later on. But together with this process has come, massive displacement of peasants from the countryside. Of course, not only in the Cerrado, but here in the southern part of the Cerrado and in the central parts, this is exactly where you had these poles of development of soy taking place and then expanding elsewhere. And even after the end of the military dictatorship, when the Workers' Party, a democratic government, was already in office, you'd still see in places of soy expansion, such as Western Bahia State, massive displacement of people taking place. The effect of this conservative modernization was this dramatic concentration of land in Brazil, where almost half of all farmland is in the hands of 1% of the landowners who have farms in excess of 1,000 hectares each, while half of the other farmers collectively own less than 2% of all the land. And these are people in small hectare, like 10 hectares or less farms. And this is not even talking about the tens of millions of landless peasants who are not even factored into this calculation. So what happens with these people is that basically they're being displaced into these famous Brazilian favelas or slums. There's no way to address urban problems in Brazil without addressing this ongoing process of conservative modernization in the countryside. It's not just concentration and displacement of people, also, of course, of biodiversity. So the Cerrado ecosystem that used to cover roughly this area, by the 2000s has been effectively reduced to this. And if you look at some of the headwaters of the Araguaia River, where I'm highlighting here, you can see the dramatic speed of this deforestation, but also the importance of environmental preservation matters. This is where we have the first environmental conservation park in the Cerrado ecosystem at the headwaters of the Araguaia River. The orange here shows the deforestation. You can see how this was in 73 when the park was established, 89, 2001. And unfortunately, this prediction for 2030 has already come to pass. So now, as the WWF says, the Cerrado is half empty and half full. Deforestation in the Cerrado proceeds at a much faster pace than the Amazon, and degradation as well. And it's not just about trees or forestation. Water is also extremely important. This is zooming into that area that I showed you massive displacement in the 2000s. The light color area are where the soy farms are. It's not just soy. They, like in the US here, they do soy and corn or soy and cotton. What you notice is that in the highlands, in the plateau, that's where they're concentrated, and then they become more sparse as you move eastwards down slope. And that's because of water. Rainfall patterns are concentrated in the higher ground there, and that's also an area that sits on top of the Urucuia aquifer, which is the second largest freshwater aquifer in South America and one of the most important in the world. What has happened is that as you start to move eastwards, you have less and less consistent rainfall, and with more and more climate change, you cannot guarantee profitable production of soy without starting to tap into irrigation infrastructure. So the area is starting to look more and more like this. Massive, massive central pivot irrigations. And as these have started to draw down the aquifer faster than it can be replenished, we're starting to see also massive droughts. Even the São Francisco River itself, this major river, halfway across the basin like this, in 2015 was effectively so dry you could basically walk across it. So what a lot of these farms have started to do is to push a second round of expansion, where they start to go from these highlands down into the valleys of these smaller creeks. And that's where the communities, the peasant communities, have their final foothold. They generally would have title or claims to some of these small plots on the valleys where they might grow some crops, but their ranching, which was their main economic activity, was effectively done in commons, in pastures in the highlands. So they were first displaced from their common pastures, and now they're being pressured in their valleys as well. Now, this type of commoning was remarkably sustainable for hundreds of years. It kept most of the vegetation intact and it kept the water cycle. But now these communities are finding that their last drips are being taken from them by these kinds of practices. Since it's become very difficult to obtain licenses for the deep water centrifugal irrigation, they're tapping these surface waters, even without licensing, which leads no alternative to these communities sometimes other than direct action. So in 2018, for example, a group of them broke into one of these farms, set fire to the irrigation pumps, which of course led to more militarization. This is an example of the conflicts that I think are very familiar throughout the Green Revolution story. But I want to come back to the geopolitical dimensions of this, to the aspect of what I call sub-imperialism, following Rui Mauro Marini, and to talk about what has then transformed this into a much larger global phenomenon. And we have to start here in the 70s. Back in the 70s, you might remember an energy crisis story, but there was a lot more to it. This was also a long-term process of the industrialization of livestock, not just in the US and Brazil, but worldwide, including in the Soviet Union. And we also had a geopolitical breakthrough where in '73, US trading companies started surreptitiously to export corn, soy, and wheat to the Soviet Union because they had a massive drought and they were no longer being able to sustain their CAFOs, their industrialized livestock production. Once that got figured out and that started to, of course, this was a massive shift in international grain trade, that then created some political repercussions and the US government imposed an embargo, which then led to Japan finding itself blocked out of access to something that it now needed desperately in order to maintain its livestock industry. So that kind of shock from 1973, it wasn't just energy prices, it was really much more deeply geopolitical, and it led Japan in particular to launch massive sustained investments to diversify its suppliers so it's not so dependent on the US alone. And that became the Japan-Brazil Cooperation Program, the Cerrado Development Program called PRODECER. It was advertised at first like this: let's support small-scale farmers, increase food production, that discourse of food security. Well, in reality, what it started to develop is an agro-environmental discourse that is going to be familiar to many of you as, as the kind of eco-modernization, eco-modernist theories that we have now. So I'm sorry this is not translated, but this is the Japanese International Cooperation Agency's document explaining this project, saying this vast region of acid soil, considered in agricultural terms, one of the most sterile lands in Brazil. This program served as a pilot project for agriculture in the Cerrado and as the development base of this vast agricultural frontier. The program contributed for the establishment of techniques of production in the Cerrado, as well as sustainable agriculture. This idea of sustainable agriculture, this idea of an eco-modernist lens on food security and on development, of transforming the so-called sterile Cerrado into this, breadbasket of the world. And the main beneficiaries were people like this, Walter Horita, people whose legacies came with the soybeans in the early 1900s, but then who became some of the largest scale farmers in the country. Now, not all of these people were Japanese. Some were, a minority eventually. But the capital was very strategically deployed. It began in the southern parts of the Cerrado in the 70s and 80s. It expanded through the 80s and the 90s effectively to the entire region. And it started to peter out by the late 90s and 2000s, less because of any domestic problems, but more because of global pressure really on deforestation on the Amazon as well, and the opportunities that started to expand elsewhere. So the Japanese International Cooperation Agency began to develop a pro-savanna project to effectively reproduce in the savannas of Mozambique their so-called success story in Brazil. And this literal drawing of parallels was how this was articulated. Pro-savanna would encounter problems, and it did not quite take off the way that it was expected. But it kind of represents this, agro-environmental narrative that reduces these landscapes to a set of parameters, like how flat their rainfall patterns, in what latitude and longitude they might fall, and that completely abstracts away from it the political ecological complexities that will show why the Green Revolution might not work as it was so-called intended, and also why pro-savanna might not be the best strategy for development in the Mozambique area. Coming back to Latin America, though, you also had during that similar time the establishment of the transnational trading and biotech companies like Syngenta, which has now been acquired by ChemChina, promoting this idea, as you can see here, of the United Soybean Republic. Similarly, talking about the fact that production practices, the same seeds, the same John Deere tractors, the same trading companies were operating across the region, and that really, from their perspective, from this transnational agribusiness perspective, there is no such thing as Brazil or Argentina or Paraguay. There's just the United Soybean Republic. Of course, that propaganda didn't quite work so well, but I think it's a very good, apt illustration of what Mauro Marini calls sub-imperialism. Brazil and Argentina are, of course, subordinate forces in a broader geopolitical terrain where US power has been hegemonic, especially talking about that clear context of the Cold War. We're talking about CIA-backed interventions and military dictatorships in places like Brazil and Argentina being used to push back against, say, anti-imperialist forces in other parts of Latin America. And this kind of sub-imperialism, where it's orchestrated in conjunction with, oftentimes also in tension with the hegemonic power, is what is also undergirding a lot of the literal expansion of soybean agribusiness into eastern Paraguay, lowland Bolivia, and now with the peace agreement in Colombia, a lot of attention, a lot of excitement from the business perspective on the possibilities to bring into the Colombian highlands the so-called success story of soybean production in Brazil and Argentina. You have people like Tranquilo Favero, who's a representative of what are called Brasiguaios, Brazilians in Paraguay, who collectively control about 70% of soybean production in that country. In Bolivia, 84% of seeds, fertilizers, and soybean trade is controlled by 4 international companies. Some from Brazil, some from Argentina, some from China. So this isn't no longer just a US kind of hegemonic thing. The logic of sub-imperialism, I think, is quite necessary to understand how this works, where these forces work collectively in and through each other. There's also been more and more conversation about having Brazilian technology and technique and capital flowing into not just in Mozambique, but Angola, Sudan, South Sudan, Cuba, Central Asia. And now Chinese investors are in a similar position that Japanese investors had been before to try and encourage the diversification of suppliers for themselves as well. So we come back to this chart here, the kind of rise of consumption from East Asia. This really is a story of Brazil-China trade. Brazilian exports of soy mainly to China. And again, to attend not just rising population or rising incomes, but to attend more specifically the industrialization of the livestock industry in China. And I'm happy to discuss these dynamics in China and between Brazil and China more if you'd like. But again, I'm trying to emphasize in this talk the geopolitical aspects of it. You'll remember that with the soy boom, you had not only a rise in trade, but also a deepening diplomatic ties between the countries. After the 2008 global financial crisis, you had the consolidation, the formalization of the BRICS group, where Brazil, China, together with Russia, India, and later South Africa, started to establish more and more formal diplomatic agreements to restructure political, economic, as well as diplomatic relations worldwide. And what this was also very much built on and advancing was the eco-modernist logic of agro-industrialization for sustainability. So, for example, when Lula, in his second government, actually his chief of staff, when his chief of staff was interviewed about this problem, he said, look, even regarding agrarian reform, I don't think that Lula applies himself as much as he cares about wages and jobs. It's the same with the environment. Sure, conservation is important, but between a cerradinho, and in Portuguese, this kind of diminutive is very condescending. Between this little cerrado that doesn't really matter and soy, he's for the soy. That's not decisive. What's decisive is the economy. And that's how you can understand that people like Katia Abreu, who herself was a very large-scale rancher and soy producer, who became the president of the Landowners Association, who was a major outspoken proponent of advancing agribusiness. That's how she was still, cozying up with the Workers' Party in the post-dictatorship period. In fact, she was made Minister of Agriculture under Dilma Rousseff's second government before she fell. And what she was really doing was not just supporting the advancement of infrastructure and capital for soy production, but much more specifically, this rhetoric of low carbon soy, of sustainable soy. This idea that came especially after the soybean moratorium, that look, soybean transnational agribusiness companies were embracing this and trying to clean up their stories, saying that, look, we've been able to effectively halt deforestation in the Amazon, even though that's not just their result, and deforestation in the Cerrado had increased dramatically more instead. So I want to now, bring in Bolsonaro in this current moment. And for that, I have to explain to you what the Workers' Party administration was and what it was built on and why it collapsed. It was built on not just petrodollars, but also soy dollars. Petrodollars might be more familiar for people who study geopolitics, but I argue that soy dollars play a similar function. Enabled, in this case, foreign exchange reserves to pay off debts and to enable the government to roll out subsidies and social programs, some of the most famous of which are Bolsa Familia, which are direct cash transfers for mothers with school-aged children, but also what is less talked about, a similar Bolsa Empresarial, subsidies for large-scale corporations, for massive construction companies, including construction companies that were advancing the agricultural frontier. And this was not, while the Workers' Party was originally based on labor movements and grassroots organizing, by the time that it became a governing coalition in the 2000s, and since then, it's just an electoral machine. So the socialist politics that it had, that democratic socialism that it was founded on in the 70s and the 80s, gave way to a kind of national developmentalist paradigm that, yes, increased minimum wages, yes, improved the working conditions, and expanded the educational opportunities for the working class. But it did that not based on political mobilization and not based on structural reforms, but largely on recycling petrodollars and soy dollars into these government assistance programs and extending cheap credit to the so-called new middle class. And it matters that it's the so-called new middle class and not a new working class for us to understand how it also fell. So all this worked fine and well during the commodity super cycle, effectively from the 2000s until the burst of the global financial crisis. This was a moment not just of rising demand from China, but also of neoliberal reforms, which in Brazil meant a return to kind of export-oriented production and these kind of deregulations that enabled a financing of this national developmentalist project without actually tackling the fundamental pillars of neoliberal political economy. And when the commodity bubble burst, there went the soy dollars, there went the Bolsa Familia, there went the Bolsa Empresarial, there went the cheap credit, and bills were due. So this was also around mobilizations around the Olympics and then the World Cup coming up. But people were kind of, that so-called new middle class now found itself with education, but no jobs, with appliances, but no longer able to pay that credit card debt. So people were taken to the streets. You had massive, political mobilization in Brazil in 2013, asking for, more education, more democracy. It was very a leftist grassroots kind of movement. And what really kind of led it to burst was public transportation fees were being hiked. And this was because, again, the price of oil had kind of collapsed. And the question was, do we then let inflation tear? How do we deal with that? As the cost of social reproduction increased, people basically took to the streets. Movimento Passe Livre, MPL, free pass. People wanted free public transportation, or at least they didn't want these hikes in transportation. And this is still a moment where some labor unions, some social movements were involved, but what you'll see is that it's no longer the kind of coordinated large-scale labor movement, no longer something that was cohesively led around a particular banner of struggle like you had the MST and struggles for land reform. This was also the beginning of a kind of pulverization of the working class and this middle class. Some of the exceptions, in addition to the MST, were the roofless people, homeless people's movement. People were not without home that would occupying urban places. But also what you started to see is that these demands that were being made started to also be demands made against the Workers' Party. It started to become a movement from the left that was not from or for the Workers' Party, that was actually exposing a lot of the limitations of what the Workers' Party agenda had been. And this idea of a new middle class was also highly problematic. In 2014, for example, you had a burst of a movement that in Brazil was called the Rolezinho, which is like a little tour. This is when basically youth, mainly youth of color, but most importantly, working class youth, were being denied access, were being harassed by private policemen in shopping malls, and they started to protest against that, characterizing this as a movement primarily of race rather than class, characterizing this as a movement of individuals trying to have access to spaces of entertainment and consumption, rather than a movement based on, demands for social goods, for a kind of different social structure, is what enabled this to become, and as effectively it was, a so-called new middle class movement. These people were being told that they're a new middle class rather than saying you're no longer a so-called sub-proletariat, you're now a working class. And then they wanted middle class consumption. They wanted middle class individualistic ideals. And the characterization, the transformation of class-based to group identity-based politics was a key instrument in Brazil in demobilizing the working class, and then also surrendering a lot of the space to people like this, who then took on the MPL slogan, turned it into MBL, Movimento Brasil Livre, radical neoliberal youth, who were extremely active on Facebook and Twitter, and who effectively co-opted a lot of those street movements and led to a transformation of a debate about development projects into a much more simplistic discussion of corruption. Also in 2014, a massive corruption scandal was in fact starting to be unfolded. And indeed, there were some Worker Party politicians involved, but they were not really the main players. The corruption in Brazil is endemic, and it was much deeper in the parties that were much more part of the political system for a much longer time. A lot of these major corporations, for example, like Odebrecht, were operating not just in Brazil, but throughout Latin America and Africa, and are some of the main instruments through which you have that kind of infrastructure construction, not just big dams, but really laying the infrastructural foundation that then gets consolidated with things like soybean agribusiness afterwards. Now, this shift of attention to corruption radically transformed the character of the streets. No longer you had primarily working class people making primarily demands for social goods like public education, public transportation. Now you had a much more middle class, not new middle class movement that then incorporated the so-called new middle class into a fight against corruption. And that then was instrumentalized specifically to target the Workers' Party. While all parties were involved, and maybe other parties were much more deeply involved in the Workers' Party, the conjunction of elite interests, mass media, corporate-controlled media in particular, and the savviness of radical neoliberal organizing on Facebook effectively transformed the entire movement into a witch hunt for Dilma. And they effectively did bring her down in a parliamentary coup, or you can just call it an impeachment process. We can discuss that later if you want, in 2015 to 2000. Now, you'd think that that's how we got Bolsonaro. Yes, but there's a lot more to the story. There was actually a very important neoliberal interregnum when the vice president Temer, from the most corrupt political party in Brazil, came in and basically applied shock doctrine. And before Bolsonaro himself came in and with a very different set of politics, this new dimension, that is the context in which the US-China trade war broke. And it's important to understand that that was a period of neoliberal interregnum so you can understand the geopolitical realignment that occurred with that. So again, if you remember how soybean agribusiness works globally, it's basically a story of US, Brazil, and to a lesser extent, Argentina exporting to China. If you were to look at soybean meal, processed soybeans, you'd see a lot more exports going from Argentina to Europe, but the rest of the map would not change very much. And the fact that this is not only the current state, but this is effectively what is expected to continue to be the case for the next decade or more is also important. Brazil is the only place that is really projected to continue to have massive expansion. And a lot of this is going to China. So Brazilian agricultural exports, which you see here, they go all over the world, but not only China is the main destination, soybeans are also dramatically concentrated in that particular channel. It's less intense, but similar with US agricultural exports. And if you look at the Chinese side of it too, first, China continues to be the only place that's really projected to account for the lion's share of soybean imports in the future. And soybeans really, really matter for their entire import platform, not just from Brazil and from the US, but from the whole rest of the world. And the way that soybean trade works effectively is that Brazil and the US are on opposite hemispheres. So they harvest in opposite seasons. So when the US crop has been harvested in the fall, it basically dominates international trade until the Brazilian crop comes in. And in the meantime, you have the growing season. So basically you have an alternation. This alternation, yearly alternation, is something that you kind of lose track if you look at it at a bigger picture, like from the 90s. And here what you can see is Brazilian exports to China surpassing US. And this radical shift right here from the US-China trade war. So it's not just a steady line, you have kind of a tendency, but then you have also a very sharp turn here. And you can catch that if you look at the period from 2017 until basically mid-2018. When tariffs come into effect, China basically stops importing from the US, as you can see in blue, and continues that way. There's very little diversification from other countries. Similarly, if you look at, this is China soybean imports. And you see Brazilian imports basically command the lion's share. What happened to US soybeans? As they stopped being shipped to China, there's an attempt to diversify them to some other countries, but it doesn't really take root very much. We can also discuss more if you want the kind of politics for the US, how that plays out within the US. But despite this kind of big picture change over a time, okay, I'll be wrapping up very soon. There was only a very short period in which which you had like windfall profits for Brazil. Effectively just appeared from late 2018. After that, markets normalized. And actually they normalized not just in terms of prices, but actually that kind of yearly swap has already kind of come back into effect by 2021. So what we see here is that that huge shock was then reabsorbed, and basically despite the ongoing tariffs, business as usual has kind of reinstated. And you might think, okay, this means windfall profits for Brazil, supposedly as a whole, or perhaps this is an opportunity for Brazil and China or BRICS in general to flex their muscles. But I argue that this is not quite useful to understand the situation. It's much better to understand what's happened in terms of class antagonisms in Brazil and elsewhere. Because first, soybean profits don't go to Brazil in general. They go to particular companies and farmers. And second, Brazil and even China don't have narrow interests around a particular crop. They have much more complex interests like that. So this is where it's important to talk about how the role that Bolsonaro plays. He came, and we can talk more about the atrocities that he's associated with, such as murdering Marielle Franco. and how he's kind of his broader set of politics. But he, despite having a lot of like anti-China rhetoric, he did not actually halt Brazilian exports to China, or even the attempt to bring in Chinese investments into Brazilian infrastructure. He just kind of left that at this kind of vice presidential level with less diplomatic fanfare. But what he really did do was to build upon this class of soybean farmers. Now we're talking about relatively large scale farmers, but there's still, I'm not talking about people that have like major agribusiness companies that have hundreds of thousands of hectares. I'm talking about a farmer who's still a so-called family farmer, might employ some labor, might farm 1,000 hectares more, but they're really kind of a rural middle class. These people are the ones who are most rabidly against the Workers' Party. These were the people who are most rabidly against the Workers' Party, I'm sorry, and the MST. And the kind of rhetoric of, okay, Bolsonaro saying, I'll empower you to take up guns and shoot trespassers on sight. That was very appealing to them, and that happens. And you start to see this change in class configuration if you follow some of the debates that have happened in recent years. In 2019, when Bolsonaro first came into power, the Landowners Association welcomed him because he, quote, pushed back against the argument that is pitting Brazil against the world, especially on environmental issues. He defended national sovereignty, meaning Brazil's right to exploit its natural resources in the Amazon, and emphasizing that that is done both for global food security and together with environmental preservation. This is the rhetoric that Brazilian agribusiness wants. They want to criticize socialism, so-called the Workers' Party, in order to basically maintain this kind of rhetoric of agribusiness as modernization and eco-modernization. Now that changed gears in recent years. The same guy, the same president of the Landowners Association started to backpedal and say, look, each of us has his own political opinions, but the association is apolitical. Our connection with the government is based on not on political parties, but based on class. What happened is that while that eco-modernist paradigm that consolidated in 2012, for example, with the deregulation of the forest code, brought together the interests of soy farmers and agribusiness, agro-industries, trading companies and all. Things really changed with Bolsonaro with this much more radical anti-environmentalist turn. His first minister of the environment, Eduardo Salles, for example, when the pandemic broke out, was caught on record in a formal government meeting saying, look, while everyone's paying attention to the pandemic, let's let the bulls pass through. Podemos ir passando a boiada. And he meant that figuratively, as in let's deregulate environmental issues, let's turn a blind eye to environmental crimes. And he also meant that literally, as in like, let's let the cattle run rampant in the Amazon. And this started to lead to pushback among many other figures in the agribusiness elite. Roberto Rodrigues, for example, who's himself a major soy farmer and was Minister of Agriculture under Lula's first government, started to say, look, among the farmers, you still have a very strong pro-Bolsonaro tendency. But in the institutions, he's talking about the associations, but also the agribusiness companies, everyone's looking at the horizon. We're having elections, and it's not clear that a lot of the agribusiness companies are really going to fall behind Bolsonaro. He says that there's a good assessment of the Minister of Agriculture, of Infrastructure, and they welcome that Bolsonaro has eventually dropped that most radical anti-environmentalist Minister of the Environment and the Foreign Affairs as well, which we can discuss, basically like attenuating some of this shift away from the kind of BRICS multipolarity and back to the US. Here you have another, I'm sorry, this is in Portuguese. You have another prominent leader of Brazilian agribusiness complaining that the credibility of the country has been lost by allowing so many illegalities in timber extraction and mining, by not dealing with land grabbing. It's not enough to just talk about bioeconomy and payment for ecosystem services to Amazon. The government has failed, and it's very, very serious. Basically, agribusiness was feeling that their eco-modernist narrative was now being threatened by the Bolsonaro regime. And then you have, for example, the Brazilian soybean industry and trading association, talking about Cargill, Dreyfus, Bunge, as well as the new entrants like COFCO, the Chinese main conglomerate in this, and Stodrogestivo from Russia. this both Brazilian, and major Brazilian companies as well. You have these major companies now criticizing Bolsonaro. So you really have now witnessed a split where you have soy farmers and some of their representatives coming out and backing Bolsonaro, even going out to the street and mass mobilizations in their favor, while some of the more institutionalized interests say, actually, look, we're not involved with this. We're not taking part in these pro-Bolsonaro demonstrations, which we're calling, among other things, for shutting down the Supreme Court and doing kind of a January 6th style occupation of government buildings in Brazil. This is the class contradiction that has now been exposed. It had already been there, but it is now really kind of being like tearing apart the agribusiness interests in Brazil. And you can see that very clearly in the soybean sector itself. I'm not going to talk a bit more about what this could have meant in terms of Brazilian integration into like China's Belt and Road Initiative and the kind of geopolitics there. Rather, what I want to talk about is more recently what's happened here, and I'll end here. But if you want to talk about China, maybe in the Q&A. Just last month, Bolsonaro went to Russia, and before he got there, he praised Putin. He expressed his solidarity with Russia. He was, in fact, very much interested in deepening economic ties with Russia, mainly because of fertilizer, mainly because Brazil imports 40% of its potassium from Russia, and because there's potential for much more partnerships there. Also because both are rabid white nationalists, Christians, in favor of a much more authoritarian style of governance, and they see themselves as partners in this global struggle against the cultural Marxist, globalist, liberal wackos that have destroyed the family and so forth and so on. The ideological affinity has also this material basis. There's been a huge struggle in Brazil, even before this, to unlock potash reserves in southeastern Amazon on indigenous territory. That project had been halted, but now with the war in the Ukraine, right now, from yesterday to today, there's a debate in Brazilian Congress to fast track these efforts to authorize mining in the Mura community, specifically because they're saying, look, all ports in the Black Sea are closed. Ukraine can no longer export, Russia can no longer export potash. If we don't have potash, we're no longer going to be able to function as the breadbasket of the world. They won't tell you that there are potash reserves in Brazil that are not in indigenous territory, but the ones that have been most sought after are exactly there. So this, again, now is fitting with the broader debate of trying to roll back indigenous protections in order to leverage this kind of national developmentalist project. I'm sorry it took me a little bit longer than expected. Thank you all so much for your patience, and I really welcome a conversation now.
And we're gonna open it up for questions, and if people have any questions. And also, I don't know if there are people in the Zoom that might be posting some questions. Maybe we can summarize those. But in the meanwhile, if anybody here in the room has any questions. Okay, yes.
Hey, Gustavo, how you doing? It's been a while. Ben Leffel, postdoc. Yeah.
No, without the mask, I recognize.
Yeah,
you.
without it, totally. So both. I mean, I was at UCI, I got PhD sociology there, and so we overlapped a little bit. So it's really interesting. I came to this and it went in a totally different direction. I mean, and I learned a lot of new things. And so what I'm interested in is your thoughts on what I've come to understand happened as a result environmentally, if you have any thoughts on it from the trade war. So my understanding is, and I've used this in teaching, is that so trade war, China retaliates on the US by importing all of its soybeans from Brazil instead of the United States, right? And what I've come to understand is that one result from that, in addition to all the what you talked about, was then the great expansion of soybean into okay, well, it's that much less unexpected side effect of the trade war was that it exacerbated climate change. I mean, insofar as there's less
Yeah, absolutely. First, it's good to see you again, Ben. The fact that Bolsonaro had removed even more environmental regulations, not just removing regulations, most importantly, is actually disabling the implementation of the laws, firing the employees that were there trying to enforce the existing environmental regulations. That's what a lot of it has played out. So indeed, what you have is more deforestation. That is for timber extraction, that's for mining extraction. A lot of the clearings are immediately used for ranching, for pasture. It is not the case that soybeans are planted immediately on recently cleared forest for a couple of different reasons. First, Amazonian soils are actually remarkably thin. Most of the organic matter is very shallow. And then as soon as you clear the forest, you need many years to actually build a type of soil system that can properly yield good soy. So what happens, and the other piece is the soy moratorium. It's difficult for a farmer on recently cleared Amazonian land to be able to market his soybeans because those trading companies have now basically took a turn where they're much more interested in promoting so-called sustainable and clean supply chains than they are on just kind of increasing supplies. So the trade war did lead to higher demand from China for Brazilian soy products, but there are several steps between Chinese demand for soy and Amazonian deforestation. And all those different steps matter. It's not that the expansion of soy is not implicated in it, but it is implicated in it more through this complex set of factors where by encouraging more consolidation of soy production in the Cerrado and in the Cerrado Amazon transition zone, the price of land there becomes too high to just ranch cattle on it. So then cattle ranchers start to then be displaced more and more into agricultural frontier areas. And there's less environmental governance on meat supply chains. So, it is more doable to ranch cattle on recently cleared forest and get away with that. So it's really about like maybe soy displacing cattle, which is then, pushing into the Amazon. That's more of a long-standing dynamic. What the trade war has done is just to kind of give it another boost.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the eco-modernist approach that you mentioned, because I had read about the eco-modernist approach, and I always thought that, well, through the, there's this manifesto that was published some years ago, and I always thought about it as, kind of this fringe, almost right-wing embracement of environmentalism or use of environmentalism, no? And didn't give it much thought as a very strong, political movement. But now you're telling me that agro-industry in Brazil is actually using that as well. And it seemed to be kind of an important discourse that they're portraying, no? So I'm wondering, how does that fit with the environmentalism that social movements like the MST has, and how does that contrast played out in Brazil?
Thanks for that question. It's very complex. I mean, and when I say this is an eco-modernist paradigm, absolutely, I am referring to the eco-modernist manifesto. But what I'm also doing is that I'm reading back into the history of the Green Revolution a kind of eco-modernism, which maybe it's not going to be the high eco-modernism of that cluster of people who are, talking about nuclear energy being so prominent and things like that. But when I step back and I look at the debates that, like you and John have been engaging with for so long on land sparing versus land sharing, the Borlaug hypothesis, that is where I'm starting to really pull that from. So what I notice is that Brazilian agribusiness will try to choose, well, some might say greenwash, to talk about sustainable soy, not just because they've turned to no-till farming and because they're talking about low carbon agriculture, but because they are rooting that on this larger neo-Malthusian narrative of global food security. And they're rooting that on that larger and more long-standing narrative that like the Norman Borlaug, that like, if we had not intensified agricultural production like this, if we had not sacrificed the Cerrado to save the Amazon, we wouldn't have been able to feed 7 billion people or more. We would have had to clear much more of the forest. So it's actually because of the intensive agro-industrial production in the Cerrado, that is what we need to save the Amazon. That paradigm is what I'm kind of saying. That is kind of a kernel of eco-modernization theory. And it fits, if you read the Eco-Modernist Manifesto and their fetish of urbanization, well, what does that mean? That requires that you kind of have this kind of, separation of, anthropogenic with pure nature conservation areas. That requires that you have this logic of intensification in order for conservation. And what agribusiness in Brazil, not just in Brazil, these are transnational companies. They're really pulling primarily from an European push, an European concern for the Pontius Pilate syndrome. They want to wash their hands and feel good about their supply chains, make sure that they're sustainable, then they're transparent. And this narrative is extremely effective, even though, as you've seen in the case of soy, most of the beans are actually going to China and not to Europe. But that actually has implemented kind of global standards where COFCO, the main Chinese trading company, is part of that same cluster. And they're saying, we're also going to respect and follow the soy moratorium. We also are going to guarantee deforestation-free soy. They're basically adopting that paradigm. Why? Because it enables them to kind of cash in on that rhetoric. Now, the way that social movements, to get to your question, have dealt with this has been very marked by conflict. There are some social movements and there are some individuals who find that, if we can make red plus work, then that can be a way to do that. And in Brazil, especially in Acre state in the Amazon, you had a payment for ecosystem services program funded in part by California that tried to decouple the payments from land ownership and try to put the payments more based on who's actually working the land. And the social movement, well, some people in the social movement, some people in the Workers' Party, swallow that, how do you say, like hook and everything, like swallowed it whole, saying like, this is what enables, this is going to be a progressive red thing. This is not a neoliberal red program anymore. This is actually going to enable the small scale farmers to now be able to do, conservation and get their payments for it too. But that was also very contested. So you had elements of the Workers' Party and of the MST and of other social movements that said, no, like that is still problematic. It's not just that we're ideologically opposed to red, it's not just that we're ideologically opposed to payment for ecosystem services, but that is still that is reinscribing the productivist logic, that a sustainable productivist approach is the way to do conservation and is not actually getting us to challenge that logic of land sparing. It's not actually getting us to have a conversation about what a diversified farming system might be, what a diversified landscape, might look like for agroecology. All of those more structural conversations are being marginalized. And this is an ongoing debate in people in the movement. I'm clearly on the side of being critical of those terms, but it is extremely challenging, especially when you have people from the movements, like we were talking this morning, who are not necessarily landless fighting for land in that kind of 20th century struggle. They are small scale farmers who are fighting for access to credit. They're fighting for access to markets, and for whom these, not just rhetorics, but their policy dimensions can be extremely useful, So that starts to create, in the MST, for example, a class contradiction as well, where the still landless component of the landless peasants movement might be much more radicalized than the recently settled component of the movement that might be much more willing to contemplate these kinds of policies and issues, but which then weaken their ability to challenge politically, conceptually, theoretically, and ideologically, and in all the different levels, these practices of eco-modernism.
This is from, I believe I'm going to pronounce it right, Nuraha from Zoom. And she says, thanks for this excellent presentation of complexities emerging from soy industry. What are your thoughts on sustainable soy from efforts such as this? And she shared an article with COFCO International, and it says COFCO International has reached traceability and completed social and environmental screening of all of its directly sourced soy from current suppliers in the Mato Piba region by December 2021, an important stepping stone towards establishing a sustainable soy supply chain in the environmentally sensitive region. And she said she can also catch up with you via email, but I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, I didn't catch the person's name, but I really thank you for the question, and I definitely welcome you to contact me by email. I'm happy to talk further about it. I want to pull back a map here that I showed here before. I want to pull back this map and then this map. COFCO is operating just like Cargill and ADM and Bunge and Dreyfus. They're operating by the highest standards, by the highest international standards of sustainability and transparency and so forth and so on. So this is not about COFCO. It's not about China versus Western, first of all. So I'm not going to answer this about COFCO. I'm going to answer this about the transnational agribusiness sector and the history of it in Brazil. When they say that they can verify that that land has not been land grabbed, what they're saying is that we have 30 years of land title records. We can trace back 30 years. That's the standard that's used in Mato Piba, which is this region here in Brazil. Now, even within these 30 years, like in 2006, you saw some of those areas were still having massive displacement. But the point is that a lot of these were areas where the displacement happened in the 70s, in the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s, because of that dictatorship that I talked about. So let's begin with this idea of land titles. Because the forced displacement, the violence took place 40 years instead of 30 years, does that make it okay? We can even make this question about 400 years. When we're talking about ongoing displacement of indigenous peoples who might not be able to trace their culture to a particular place anymore because they've been displaced over so many generations and centuries. So this conversation about transparency and sustainable supply chains has parameters, and those parameters are conveniently located with these markers, such as like 30 years of clean title, which exactly brackets out the period in which the Mato Piba was kind of land grabbed. And then the questions of environmental sustainability. Sure, the Mato Piba, we're talking about the northeastern Cerrado. This is not the area of the Amazon. And a lot of the concern there, charismatic megafauna, is on protecting the Amazon while sacrificing the Cerrado. Now, nonetheless, the Cerrado is an extremely important ecosystem on its own right. And when companies like Cargill or Costco or whatever say that they can guarantee that their soy is deforestation free, they're not meaning that there has been no clearing. What they mean is that they're conforming with things like the soybean moratorium on the Amazon. So if you deforested the Cerrado for that, that doesn't get nearly as much attention or problem as deforesting the Amazon. And companies, all of those companies, they're all part of ABIOVI, that association. They resist, they actively lobby against and resist expanding into the Cerrado the same environmental governance policies that have been applied in the Amazon. So there is no, soy moratorium for the Cerrado, because that would effectively shut down the industry. So what do we mean by sustainable soy? Oh, because we use no-till farming, because we're reducing the consumption of the most toxic pesticides. None of that is actually tackling the much more structural problems, I think, of both the history and the ongoing environmental, contamination of soils and things like that, that have nothing to do with deforestation. The reduction of environmentalist discourses to deforestation-free and sustainable supply chains is by and large a charade, is by and large a smokescreen to not talk about pesticide use and intoxication, and just talk about, well, which trees have been cut or not.
Just to add to that, a lot of the no-till is using Roundup, no? So you increase the amount of herbicide that you're applying, and yes, you're doing it, in a way that is not tilling the land and affecting the land in that way, but then the tons of herbicide that are applied are having an environmental impact as well.
Absolutely. Thanks for adding that, Yvette.
Yeah.
And what we see is that, like, with no-till and the biotech seeds that have come associated with herbicide use, like glyphosate, now there's more and more resistance, like wheat, like super weeds that are resistant to glyphosate. So we see more and more like 2,4-D and atrazine being rolled back out. So the idea that these more toxic herbicides were a thing of the past, actually no, they're making a comeback because of the sheer system of production based on large-scale monocultures like that.
Before we thank again. Oh, okay. The final question.
No pressure.
Hello.
Hello.
This isn't as much a question so much as just thank you so much, because these analyses of history, I think, are pretty, it took clearly so much work to connect these dots, and just thank you for your historical, context. And it never ceases to surprise me how the same methods are used all over the world to suppress movements, and then also even getting more specific, land worker movements. And it's incredible. And it's, it never ceases to surprise me. And, I could go on, but just thank you so much. And I'm also curious, maybe this is a question, just more about your work in the UN, and what that's been like for you.
Sure. So first, thanks for the kind words. I think it is very important, and I'm glad that you appreciate the history. I'm afraid that this is the first time I'm doing this presentation. I would have, I think, spent like 10 minutes less in the history, so I could spend 10 minutes more on the recent years. So my apologies for that. I'll rework it better. Oh, okay, I'm glad. But with the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network created what's called the Science Panel for the Amazon. And my mentor and colleague, Susanna Hecht, who will be speaking with you in the next iteration of this lecture series, invited me to join a group of folks writing 2 chapters for a report. The report was launched just this past November with COP26, right? Yeah, whatever COP it over. And the idea there was to kind of like do similar to what the IPCC does for climate, to do that for the state of the Amazon. So the first chunk of the report is basically environmental science like what do we understand about the Amazon from its geology and hydrology through its ecology and biology up through all Earth system science. And then the second part is a bit more like human inclusive, and it kind of gives the whole history, beginning with the first settlements of First Nations there through the colonization, European colonization. And the parts that I worked on were especially on a chapter that was talking about the development dynamics since the 20th century, trying to explain why deforestation had become so dramatic over the course of the 20th century, why, particularly in Brazil, it was radically reduced in the early years of the 2000s under the Workers' Party administration with the eco-modernist paradigm of let's save the Amazon by sacrificing the Cerrado, but with very vigorous and good environmental policies and regulations being rolled out there, especially working landscapes, especially extractivist reserves, which in Brazil, what we mean by that are like community-owned and community-managed commons, like agroforestry, for example, rubber tappers, and things like that. But then also to try and explain what then led to a reversal of that. So basically the focus is on 20th century development paradigms in relation to particularly deforestation, but also like environmental change more broadly. And then another chapter that we wrote was doing a more like in-depth look at changes in land ownership, land control, labor in different production systems, both what we called the kind of wage-based systems, basically larger scale commercial capitalist endeavors, and the more like family-based systems. And that was, with spectacular data from like Francisco Costa, an economist in Brazil, we're able to really like trace, especially over the last like 30, 40 years, like when we talk about, like when I was answering Ben's question, like we're talking about clearing, when we're talking about land grabs, what is really happening there? Where, like, how is land ownership shifting? Is between like ranchers and farmers, between small scale farmers and large scale farmers, kind of doing a much more nuanced analysis of that. Those are just two chapters that I contributed to, together with like, I don't know, we were like 10 or 15 people. And there were like fish biologists and, ecosystem people, and there was like a whole group of people. Like Phil Fernside was there. Our fearless leaders were Susanna Hesch, like I mentioned, and Marian Schmink at Florida. Phil Fernside played a big role. Chiquito Francisco Costa played a big role. It was a great team. All that I did was just be like a junior partner in it and kind of like contribute what I could to that. We ended up writing way more, like we wrote like 80 pages and we had to come down to just 20 or 30 for each chapter. So I learned a lot. Mostly I learned a lot by working with those colleagues. UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Science Panel for the Amazon. The UN SDSN is kind of like a big umbrella for different kinds of activities, like the Science Panel for the Amazon. The Science Panel for the Amazon is led by people like Carlos Nobre. There's like some real famous big people behind all of this. I was just like a foot soldier in contributing to some chapters in the report. Oh. The website is called The Amazon We Want. I think if you just Google that, the Science Panel for the Amazon or the Amazon We Want, you can find the full report as well as the executive summaries. And you'll be able to find the name of the authors contributing to all the chapters. And the website also has like a short little blurb about all the contributors.
Okay, and with that, I think you should all join me in thanking Gustavo